It worked! Finally. Hey everyone, Oli here, and this is my review of Planet of the Daleks, the fourth story of the 10th season of classic Doctor Who, starring John Pertwee as the third Doctor. Planet of the Daleks is a 68 story overall, it's 6 episodes long, and is written by Terry Nation, and this is Terry Nation's first story he has written for Doctor Who since the Daleks Master Plan back in season 3. And this story is also the second and final part of the Dalek War duology. So this story actually continues from where Frontier in Space actually ended, and what happened there. The Doctor and Joe get caught up in some ruckus with the Ogrons under the influence of the Master's fear machine, which causes the Master to shoot the Doctor and ending up grazing his head, and then Joe pretty much had to take him to the TARDIS, and then the Doctor pretty much had to send a message to the Time Lords while the TARDIS had taken off from the Ogron planet. So that is what leads up to this story, and the plot of Planet of the Daleks is as follows. The TARDIS arrives on Spiridon, an inhospitable planet where the vegetation is hungry and extremely dangerous. The Doctor has been badly hurt and has fallen into a coma, so it's up to his concerned assistant Joe to leave the safety of the TARDIS to find help. She soon discovers a jungle containing invisible creatures, and that planet is hiding a terrible secret about the Doctor's oldest enemy, the Daleks. And there's something at the bottom of the DVD that says, since the mid 1970s, episode 3 of the story has been available in 16mm black and white film recording, but for this DVD release has been returned to full color. In my opinion, Planet of the Daleks is a very good story. It's definitely the best of the trio of Dalek stories that are in the John Pertwee era, but it's not really saying much because both stories do have their faults. For instance, Planet Day of the Daleks does have some pacing issues, and the story's conclusion was very rushed, and Death to the Daleks in the following season had some very severe pacing issues after episode 1, and Planet of the Daleks itself does have some faults. The production of the story was very good. I liked the Spirited jungle set. It was very reminiscent of the jungle sets and the Dalek stories are in the William Hartnell era, especially from in Skara, the Daleks' actual home planet, and I think it was Kemble in the Daleks' master plan. I also like the special effects of the story, especially the invisible spiriters and how the Doctor was able to unveil the invisible Daleks and the makeup that was used to represent the fungus that had actually infected Joe. The script was good. The dialogue was nice. The direction by John Maloney was good. Not as good as the last story he directed, which was The Walking, but he still did his best, and I actually liked that. The plot was okay, and the main criticism of the story, this is actually my main criticism as well, it is pretty much the same as the first ever Dalek story, and it does borrow elements from all the Dalek stories, and so the marks for originality is pretty much lost. It does have some of its own elements, such as the Spiridons and having invisible Daleks, for instance. But that was quite good, and I liked how there were references to previous Dalek stories, such as the first ever Dalek story, The Daleks, and where the Doctor, as well as Ian, Barbara, and Susan, had pretty much become a legend amongst the Thals, thanks to the Doctor defeating the Daleks over there. And I also liked how the jungle sounds were brought back from the 1960s into this story, so it was a nice little mention for that. Previously had it the story, it was very far apart from Frontier in Space, and it actually had been resolved during a rewatch of the story over the summer, and it was actually resolved because I actually wasn't really paying attention during the first watch. Was the Doctor explaining to Joe why are they on Spiridon, and the Doctor actually explained because he sent a message to the Time Lords to find out where the Daleks were, and then the Time Lords sent the TARDIS to Spiridons, and so you can stop the Daleks' plans for world domination, the universal domination, and so that at least establishes some other link other than this story actually starting on the end of Frontier in Space. But I do wish there were more links from Frontier in Space in this story. It would have probably made a lot more sense in my opinion. There are some really good moments, but not as memorable as other Dalek stories, and I did like the part when Taran was being told by Rebecca about 10,000 Daleks being on Spiridon, and the ending where the Supreme Dalek was pretty much speaking to the camera, well, which indicates that he's speaking to the audience, saying that the Daleks were delayed, but the Daleks will never ever be defeated. And I also like the part when the Doctor and the Thals were pretty much escaping from the Dalek base from using I think basically making a makeshift hot air balloon, but instead of there being like a platform to stand on, they were pretty much just holding on to whatever that they were holding to so they can escape. It was a very good idea. I think John Pertwee did his best, but as I mentioned before, Pertwee didn't really like working with the Daleks. I think he found them a bit difficult to act alongside, but he does do his best here. And I like the bit when Taron was talking to the Doctor about a legendary being that came to Skar when the Thals were in their greatest peril, and the Doctor responds that he's the very same Doctor that actually helped the Thals back then, but Taron wasn't convinced, but then the Doctor actually convinced him in the end. And I actually like that scene. It was a nice reference to the first Dalek story again. There's so many references to the story. I actually like all these continuity stuff. Katie Manning, I think she did an okay job in the story. Jo does find herself separated from the Doctor for most of the story until they reunite in episode 4. I like how Jo was able to brave the Spiridon jungle alone, whilst the Doctor was near death in the TARDIS. I also like the scene at the end when the Doctor and Jo had left Spirit and the Doctor was offering to take Jo to another places. He was showing her other places, but then Jo showed the Doctor Earth and pretty much indicating that she wanted to go home. It was rather poignant and it does lay the foundation for Jo's exit in the following story, The Green Death. Another bit that actually foreshadows Jo's exit was her romance subplot with Sleetap. This is very similar to Barbara falling for one of the Thousand of Dalek, and that was another issue I had with that story because I didn't really think that it made sense in a way, and it doesn't really make sense in this story as well. So onto the side characters, and most of them are pretty much the Thals that assisted the Doctor and during this story, and the Thals were Taran. He was the leader of the first Thal group on the expedition to Spiridon. He was a very good character, and he was played by Bernard Horsfall, who's been on Doctor Who before, especially in Patrick Troughton's final stories in season 6, such as the Mind Robber and playing Gulliver, and he played one of the Time Lords that was overseeing the Doctor's trial before he went into exile. And I actually rather like this character. I think he's definitely one of my favorite side characters from the Pertwee era. Weber, he was a rather volatile member of the Thals, and he acted as a bit of a foil to Taran. They did make peace, but he ended up getting killed by the Daleks. And we also had Rebek. She was a member of the second task force that was sent to Spiridon to warn the first task force about the true number of Daleks on Skaro. She was also Taran's lover, and that pretty much made her another interesting character because she was able to hold on her own and not being held back by any of the characters, even though Taran wasn't actually too happy that Rebecca was here because he was actually worried about her. Later, another member of the second Thal task force, and he wasn't really a huge fan of the army lifestyle. He fell for Jo and he asked her to come back to Skull with him. Marat, he was another member of the Thal task force that was killed. And we have the Spiridon Wester. He was one of the invisible natives of Spiridon. He later sacrificed himself to prevent the release of the virus that the Daleks had created. So as you can see, all of them were, except the rest there were Thals, but then they were all the side characters were quite rather good in this story, and they're not as good as the side characters in Frontier in Space, but yeah, they were still quite good. Now we have our enemies and the true big bads of the two interwoven stories, the Daleks. The ape wanted to conquer the entire universe by wiping out the inhabitants with a deadly virus that they created, and that pretty much gives a reason for their appearance in Frontier in Space. The Daleks, in my opinion, were very well written in this story, and Terry Nation did his creations justice here. The Daleks also looked great. They don't sound as they sounded in Day of the Daleks, and the Daleks were actually a legitimate threat here, as we see that there were 10,000 Daleks in the underground caves of Spiridon, and I also liked how the production was able to use like mini toy Daleks to represent a large number of Daleks to try and make it look more authentic compared to the free Dalek army we saw in Day of the Daleks. And I also love the look of the Supreme Dalek as well because it is actually one of my favorite Dalek designs, and I think it was used from the Peter Cushing Dalek movies, I believe. I'm not entirely too sure, but I think that's where they're from. So onto the thoughts I have of this story. Obviously, I mentioned this Planet of the Daleks actually uses the same plot as the Daleks, but with some bits here and there added, and it was a bit obvious that Terry Nation hadn't actually written in Doctor Who for a very long time, because when he was actually brought back, he still thought that Doctor Who was still using individual episode titles, something that hasn't been used since season three's The Gunfighters, and was abandoned from the following story, The Savages, onwards. I also think this story does drag a bit in the middle, especially when the Doctor and George reunited and they were just pretty much tossing the Daleks into that steam pit, I think. And I do wish Terry Nation had actually borrowed some characters in Frontier in Space for this story to actually work, such as the Earth President. She can actually see the threat of the Daleks themselves herself, and she could probably with St. Williams to try and help the Doctor and the Thals to try and defeat the Daleks. And the Master wasn't mentioned here at all. Well, Frontier and Planet are loosely related, but I think with the mission of Frontier Elements, it made Planet of the Daleks feel more of a standalone compared to Frontier in Space, and considering the fact that the Daleks had actually employed to hire the Thals to work for them, it would have made a lot more sense to have at least had the thousand twin the Ogrons. my mistake. I wish they had the Ogrons ones in this story to at least try and make the story a little bit better. So to conclude this review, I think Planet of the Daleks is a good way to celebrate 10 years of the Daleks, but it didn't really need to use a lot of the plot elements from the first Dalek story. And the way I see it, imagine if the Day of the Doctor actually used this very same plot as the Unearthly Child. That's how I pretty much feel about it. But it's still an enjoyable story, but not exactly my favorite story ever. So I gave this story an 8 out of 10. My next review will be the season 10 finale and the departure of Joe Grant. And that will be the Green Death, so please look out for that. Thank you very much for watching the story. Please let me know what you thought of this review and Planet of the Daleks itself. Please subscribe to my channel and join my Discord server, and the link is in the description below. Until then, see you later.